Thank you, Don. A world figure recently commented, "How can we ignore the fact that food has become an object of speculation or is connected to movements in a financial market that, lacking in clear rules or moral principles, seems anchored on the sole object of profit?" Those words were spoken a little over a month ago by Pope Benedict when he addressed the Rome-based Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He was referring to the way food has become a commodity that is now traded without regard to the needs of the world's hungry. This was reported to the Tablet, the International Catholic Weekly based in London. The exact words were, "The Holy See has identified a new public enemy, the speculator." And yet, as long ago as 1933, Amar O'Duffy presented the same situation in his comic fiction Goshawk trilogy. King Goshawk is in council in Manhattan discussing the state of world trade with the leading executive officers of the global corporations. And we read, "Now, the matter under discussion at the meeting was a disastrous plenitude of certain crops, notably milk and rice, due to a most unfortunate succession of fine seasons over large parts of the world, whereby the profits of many princes had been seriously diminished and large numbers of their subjects thrown out of employment, with worldwide repercussions in trade depressions, bankruptcies, and distress. By flooding the world with cheap dairy produce and rice, some producers had caused universal misery and starvation and undone all the good achieved during the past 10 years by King Goshawk's policy of wheat restrictions." In the first book of the trilogy, King Goshawk and the Birds, Cundinya, son of the Irish folk hero Cuchulainn, comes to earth on his quest to rescue the songbirds and the wildflowers from the grip of King Goshawk, the Wheat King. King Goshawk ruled the world. He was not king of any individual nation, and yet he was able to dictate to the rulers and nations of the people, on the advice of his financial expert, what was financially possible and what was not. And as we see in the course of the story, the global king was able to back his decisions by the most sophisticated weapons of military destruction yet devised by man. Goshawk is master of all, but his financial advisor, Mr. Slormikander, is the power behind the throne. Asses in Clover is so true to life in the 21st century that I've been accused of writing the story myself and making up the existence of O'Duffy. I can assure you that O'Duffy was a very real person who lived from 1893 to 1935. Like so many of his contemporaries, O'Duffy was deeply affected by the lunacy of the First World War and disillusioned by revolutions in Russia and China. After writing The Spacious Adventures of the Man in the Street, the second book of the trilogy, O'Duffy came across the work of Clifford Hugh Douglas and the social credit movement, which was only just then emerging as a world phenomenon. What exactly is social credit? Is it a social movement, a body of economic theory, a philosophy, a scheme of monetary reform? Social credit is best described as a body of literature offering knowledge of the workings of the money economy within the wider society within which it exists. It is based upon the writings of Clifford Hugh Douglas, who lived from 1875 to 1952. We speak of the economy and the money economy as if they were interchangeable terms. Mainstream economics is the study of the production, distribution, and exchange for money of material goods and practical services. The money or financial economy bears no necessary relationship to the real economy, which is the key to all human endeavour and indeed the vital necessity for human existence. The way we handle the natural resources of the earth and the human skills and talents, those things which comprise the real economy, is of vital importance to the continued existence of humanity. This fact of life is presently obscured by the power of the financial economy. That power is laid down in law and backed by physical force. How that came to be the case, and why it's necessary to seek new directions at this point in history, and where to look for positive change, are questions to be raised in this series of talks. When Amar O'Duffy came across Douglas's teaching, he related it to his own reading. He had studied all the major economists of the time, including the works of Marx and minor monetary reformers. By 1932, he had published Life and Money, being a critical examination of the principles and practice of orthodox economics with a practical scheme to end the muddle it has made of our civilization. Life and Money is a valuable guide through the maze of conflicting approaches to the role of money in the economy. His final work, Asses in Clover, was written when he was already a sick man. It was informed by his researches preparatory to the writing of Life and Money. It's not a literary masterpiece. All the same, it provides a series of highly amusing snapshots of the follies of a world economy dominated by finance, self-interest, and the profit motive. These 4 talks will be illustrated by passages from Amar O'Duffy's writings. In the next talk, we will hear how the powers of finance came to rule the world through a history of the Church in England, and then we will hear about the institutional structures of the 21st centuries. And finally, we will hear some closely guarded secrets about the options open to us ordinary folk. But first, I must tell you a little about my own story. As a student at university in the 1960s, I was taught nothing of the things revealed by Amar O'Duffy, Clifford Hugh Douglas, or anybody else in the social credit movement. It was decades later that I came across Douglas's writings through an odd series of coincidences. However, from my earliest childhood, I had pondered on the necessity for war. I was born in London during the war, almost exactly 70 years ago. I grew up knowing that my parents were on one side, but my grandparents were on the other. Later, in my teens, I visited Salzburg. My mother's friends cheerfully pointed out the sites of the munitions factories where they had worked during the war. To them, it was just a place of work, like any other. And I knew the story of American aeroplanes dropping atomic bombs onto cities full of people in Japan. The continued evidence of poverty amidst plenty also puzzled me. Surely, the Industrial Revolution had brought an end to scarcity in the land, and yet there were slums and famines in Africa. What was going on? I studied economics to A-level as one of the first students of economics at that level in a state school. It did not make sense even then. We were taught the circular flow diagram. In this diagram, you can see that there are the households and the businesses. The households have got the things which the businesses want, and the businesses have the things which the households want. So the households take the land, labour and capital and give it to the businesses, Businesses with those resources produce the goods and services which the households need. In return for getting the factors of production from the households, the businesses give an income to the households. The households take that income and spend it as consumers on the goods and services which the firms have produced. The money then flows back into the businesses and the whole cycle starts again. Obviously, the model is static. If the money earned by the factors of production flowing from the households simply equals the value of the goods produced by the businesses, where does the growth come from? Where does one get the increase or added value? I wanted some answers. My teacher was a Latin master who had recently studied economics. He knew nothing more than he had been taught. He suggested that I work hard, pass the exams, go to university, and ask my questions there, which I did. It was easy enough to regurgitate the material and pass the exams. Neoclassical economics is elegant and consistent and easy to learn if you're of that frame of mind, happy to juggle figures, playing with graphs and statistics. But it is totally divorced from real life. It's rigid and static. Every child brought up near the land knows that you cannot keep taking from the vegetable plot without putting back compost or manure. If you don't just get diminishing returns, you get no returns at all. And there I left matters for the time being. I worked and travelled in Europe and Africa and brought up a family, and from time to time I even taught core curriculum economics to keep the wolf from the door. When my sons left home, I registered as a postgraduate student in the Department of Economics at Bradford University. What should I study? I wanted to understand why core curriculum economics was taken so seriously. Was there no alternative to the circular flow and the rigid model? At the time, I was active in the Green Party. Not a particularly move in this here, I understand. I was active campaigning on issues of basic income, world poverty, anti-war, a sense for sufficiency, and environmental sustainability. But it's all been said before, said my neighbour, Tommy Tinkler. What that means is social credit. And I looked at him blank. And he said, "Hast thee not heard of social credit?" 50 years before, he had studied the works of Major Douglas at a university extension course. He was also a member of the 3 weekly social credits discussion groups in Keighley, the town where we live. He proceeded to give me an off-the-cuff explanation of the A plus B theorem, the just price, and the national dividend, and provided me with some literature to read for myself. Brian Burkitt was my supervisor for my postgraduate studies. As senior lecturer in economics at Bradford University, he was a great support in my work on the social credit movement. Clifford Hugh Douglas had undertaken private research into national and international finance in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. I discovered masses of material, periodicals, pamphlets, full-length books, and even radio broadcasts. The writings of Douglas and others were published on a worldwide scale and gave rise to a massive popular movement. There was even a social credit government in Alberta, Canada. I discovered a whole new world. There really were people who had thought through the whole question of the relationship between the money economy and the real world economy. What I read went far beyond the realms of that dismal science. of economics as taught in schools, colleges and universities. I had been told about communism, anarchism, feminism, pacifism and all manner of protest against the dominance of global capitalism. But never a word had I heard of Douglas or the worldwide social credit movement. It took me roughly 7 years to complete the research and writing for my first refereed book on Douglas and the social credit movement. During this time, I travelled to conferences up and down the UK and in Europe, giving papers, publishing refereed journals, and studying the papers of others. I searched for academics who might be interested enough to collaborate. But there was something wrong. Time and again, when I thought I'd presented a really interesting paper, a professional journalist stood up and asked the question, was that the Major Douglas who was anti-Semitic? My first book, co-authored with Brian Burkitt, was a refereed work published by the academic publishers Routledge, the 14th in their series of studies in the history of economics. It was entitled The Political Economy of Social Credit and Guild Socialism. In this way, for the very first time, Douglas was included as an economist worthy of study within the academic world. In researching the book, it was with considerable surprise that I discovered that the origins of social credit were firmly rooted in guild socialism. As far as I knew up to that point, guild socialists like William Morris and John Ruskin were dilettante capitalists, right-wing paternalists who wanted to make life better for their workers. Real socialists would take the power from these charlatans and hand it to the workers. It was a real eye-opener to read the works of these thinkers and to discover notions of good work being undertaken within human-sized structures through willing cooperation, free from the power of the debt money system and free from wage slavery. Most particularly, I was delighted to discover that these guild socialist thinkers had their hearts firmly rooted in the soil. They saw urban poverty not merely in terms of material deprivation, but most particularly in its cultural and spiritual dimensions. For the health of the nation, it was essential to revive a love for the land and the natural world upon which we all depend. Back in the 1990s, when Brian Burkitt and I collaborated on the writing of The Political Economy, we published a whole series of papers on the social, political, economic, financial and environmental implications of the centralisation of financial power. I certainly imagined that it was only a matter of getting the material out into the public arena through mainstream publishers and publications, and it would be taken up by all people of goodwill. At this time, I collaborated with my son Andrew in the writing of a university text on environmental business management for McGraw-Hill. We imagined at the time that global corporations were genuinely interested in reducing their ecological footprints, managing waste, and bringing production down to a human scale. At this time also, I collaborated with Mike Rowbottom as he revised The Grip of Death, and I wrote What Everybody Really Wants to Know About Money. Both these books continue to attract interest and discussion in the academic world and outside. By 2002, the final draft of my fourth book, The Politics of Money, was about to be sent to Pluto Press, when a determined effort was made to sabotage the publication. Through our publications, the academic world had started to take some interest in social credit ideas, and Professor Mary Mellor and Dr. Wendy Olson were collaborating with me on the politics of money, when a 17-page article was circulated to every individual in academia and in the voluntary sector who had entered into discussions with myself or my colleagues. The article, entitled Social Credit, the Eco-Socialism of Fools, named all the individuals who had commented in print on the subject in recent times. It cited contemporary works such as Janine Stingle's Social Discredit, Anti-Semitism, Social Credit, and the Jewish Response, published by a reputable academic publisher in the year 2000. Stingle's sole purpose was to establish that the social credit movement was entirely devoted to attacking Jews and nothing else. The first I heard of this was in June 2002, when I received an email from the author, Derek Wall. It read, in very bad English, as follows. Hi. I'm enclosing a draft of my article on Douglas social credit. I am afraid it is fairly negative, but I thought it was fair to let you have a look. I am a bit dubious about people recommending social credit because of all the balmy anti-Semitism inherent in recommending the protocols. So who is this Derek Wall, who has contact information for every writer and academic who might recommend that people read material for themselves in order to form their own judgments, and who can address me as Hi because we have met many times? He had made his way up the echelons of power in the UK Green Party into a commanding position. Wall's article, which was inexplicably published by an academic journal over a year later, used a series of lies, half-truths and innuendo to establish guilt by association. Hitler was a fascist. Hitler was a vegetarian. Therefore, all vegetarians are anti-Semitic. That was his line of argument. Anybody who ever mentioned the word social credit or associated with somebody who did so was by definition anti-Semitic. The effect was electric. I dropped in to see Mary Mellor at her home in Newcastle at the time. She was hysterical, and her husband wanted me out of the house as soon as possible. She was backing out of the publication of The Politics of Money. It would ruin her career if she continued. Eventually, I persuaded her to allow the publication to go ahead by assuring her that Douglas was not gunning for the Jews in the sense implied, and promising to establish the fact through research. Although the book was published and one or two excellent reviews appeared, the published reviews were few and far between, as editors simply omitted to publish reviews they had initially requested. The book sank into oblivion. 7 years later, I drew a halt to my researches. John Carpenter agreed to publish, and these researches are recorded in the book Understanding the Financial System. Though I say it myself, it does make fascinating reading. I found that there were many reasons for the silencing of the discussion about social credit. The Alberta Experiment was at the heart of the matter. Had the experiment in ditching the party system been allowed to succeed, genuine democracy would have spread from Alberta throughout Canada and across the whole world. Hence, it was absolutely essential that the true story of what actually happened in Alberta between 1935 and 1943 be suppressed. To do justice to the subject, I would have needed a team of full-time researchers. Despite the publication of masses of material which had been in the public arena from the early 1920s until the early 2000s, the history and theories of Douglas social credit have been systematically eliminated from the academic field of study. Academics teach on Marxism as an objective, though perhaps mistaken, body of ideas, but they cannot raise the subject of social credit and retain their academic posts. The fundamental question arises: how do ordinary people form an independent judgment about banking, finance, and the social framework under which they have grown up and now live and work? A movement which gave rise to 3 national weeklies in the UK, a host of local periodicals throughout the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the USA and elsewhere, and literally dozens of publications, both mainstream and in-house, has been systematically airbrushed out of history. Was this genuinely because it was fascist, right-wing, anti-Semitic? Or was there some other reason? My research has revealed the uncompromising truth. Anti-Semitism had nothing whatsoever to do with the suppression of the study of social credit. Social creditors today are thoroughly familiar with the volume of literature on social credit which is available for study in libraries, personal collections, and on the internet. What they are less familiar with is the literature attacking social credit. This is very interesting. It reveals a lot about the motives of the defenders of the status quo. The reams of attack on Douglas's approach to the political economy are totally inexplicable if one accepts the line they take. 21st century detractors claim that Douglas was talking arrant nonsense, that he had only a few deluded followers, but that those few were so dangerously fascist that they had to be suppressed as a matter of duty before they contaminated the whole of decent society. Detractors during the 1920s, 30s and 40s had a far more difficult task. They were facing a popular movement calling for a national dividend, democratic government and press freedom. Very many ordinary people, like my neighbour and O'Duffy, had studied mainstream economics and Douglas's work and found the former wanting. Something had to be done, and so the big guns were brought to bear on the movement during the 1930s. In my various publications, I've looked at the opponents of social credit, their reasons and their motivations. Today I will focus on one individual who, for 2 decades, took up the position of authority in respect of social credit in the UK. Geoffrey Crowther became editor of The Economist in 1938 at the age of 31. Throughout the 20th century and to the present day, The Economist is the major opinion-forming periodical of the political establishment. In 1934, when he was already a rising star at The Economist, Crowther published a series of 4 articles in the News Chronicle, a national UK daily. His purpose was to demolish the case for social credit. Subsequently, the articles were amalgamated into an appendix on social credit in his book, Major Text on Money, An Outline of Money, which was published in 1940. The appendix was reprinted in 9 reprints until 1947, when the danger was considered to be over, and the appendix does not appear in the 1948 reprint. In 1934, the 27-year-old rising star at The Economist had this to say about the worldwide social credit movement. Why it should have a particular appeal to the general public, I do not know. Social credit deals with the extremely difficult and technical subject of monetary theory, which one would not expect to have a wide popular appeal. Moreover, the writings of its adherents are marked by obscurity rather than clarity, by ambiguity rather than precision. The magnitude of its claims would be, one would think, a deterrent to many people. One is naturally suspicious of a theory which promises the abolition of poverty, the reduction of the likelihood of war to zero, rapidly diminishing crime, the beginning of economic freedom for the individual, and the introduction of the leisure state, and all by means of simple bookkeeping. I think it is this natural suspicion which explains how little one hears of social credit movement in the press. The social creditors believe they suffer from a corrupt conspiracy of silence, but it is far more likely that they suffer from nothing more than the incredulous caution with which the working journalist treats all vendors of gold bricks or discoverers of El Dorado. Whatever the cause for the popularity of social credit, there can be no doubt about its present extent or about the fervour of its adherents. Nothing but good can come of the fullest possible discussion of a theory which has such an evident popular appeal. Translated, the latter two sentences reveal the reasoning behind the writing of the articles in the News Chronicle. Douglas had become too big a name to be ignored completely. It was necessary to cut the movement down to size. Crowther continues, Major Douglas, as an engineer, is rather apt to assume that the engineers have solved the problem of poverty and that only the economists and the politicians stand in the way. In point of fact, the technical problem of producing goods is as small a part of the whole economic problem as engine driving is of running a railway. Here, as throughout his 4 articles, Crowther never spells out exactly how Douglas has got it wrong. We are only told that one is naturally suspicious of a theory which promises the abolition of poverty, the reduction of the likelihood of war to zero, rapidly diminishing crime, the beginning of economic freedom for the individual, and the introduction of the leisure state, and all by means of simple bookkeeping. That is the key to the whole question of finance. Simple bookkeeping and plain common sense. Nowhere in his appendix on social credit or in the rest of his outline of money does Crowther demonstrate that the facts and theories which inform mainstream economists and politicians are superior to social credit ideas. It is all done by innuendo, creating an illusion of authority. At the heart of the problem is the pyramid of power. One of Douglas's very early articles spelled out the growth of centralised power over all aspects of our lives. This power has grown exponentially since Douglas wrote those first articles in 1918. Huge centralised bureaucracies of commerce, industry and finance dominate production, politics and the media. Systems are planned. Authority flows from the apex of the pyramid of power down to the powerless base of the masses. The Roman Empire was governed in this way, along military lines, with the chain of command flowing from the emperor at the apex, like the commander on a battlefield. Modern corporate bureaucracies continue to be run on exactly the same lines. Indeed, military terminology permeates the entire social sphere, especially the whole employment system. The captain of industry is the chief executive officer. The company is run on principles of staff and line management, with advertising campaigns run on lines of strict discipline. Employees in health services, education services, that is in schools and colleges and universities, and in the caring professions, accept the ruling of their line managers. They go on leave when they mean on holiday. They negotiate sick leave. and even maternity leave, and so on. Human society has become a vast bureaucracy run on military lines and backed by the forces of law and order. In this 21st century, the fictional dystopias of Forster, Huxley and Orwell are emerging as all too real. Nobody knows what is really going on. Seemingly, we are all powerless, and the powers that be at the apex of the pyramid are anxiously determined that things should stay that way, because that is how they hold on to their power. Now, this here represents the pyramid of power. We have the inner and outer party here, the small 2% or so of the population, and the mass of individuals at the base. The capitalists, the workers, and others. If we look at this second diagram, which was produced in 1937, it appeared in The New Age, we see that we have at the top of the pyramid high financial policy. And this whole section coming down to the parliaments and nations of the people is represented by that top part of the inner and outer party, the 2% or so of the population. The mass of the people are here at the bottom, the will to economic plenty, the policy of the individuals. And here we have the desire to come up the pyramid to put their power into action, and this goes as far as the parliaments of the nations. But unknown to the bulk of the people, this whole complex of organisations, interlinking institutions, actually control what exactly is going on. So we have the structures of power coming downwards and oppressing the people who form the bulk of the population, but also, of course, provide all the goods and services which are necessary for the whole of the community to survive. The pyramid then is a rigid, stands rigidly on its structure, on the base. It says stop, no way through. The command passes down through the hierarchies, through the all-powerful commander at the top to the powerless minions at the bottom. A turning point in the story of Asses in Clover is when the demigod Kundinya recognises the inability of the ordinary people to see through the lies and fabrications of the powers that be at the top of the pyramid. When Kundinya had finished speaking, a vast silence descended upon the world. The unfortunate people, being so muddled in their heads by all they had been taught by their school teachers, their professors, their novelist philosophers, their publicists, their economists, their politicians, and their newspapers, that they were quite incapable of thinking for themselves. How this situation came about, we will hear in the next talk.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchinson. I read Social Credit and Guild Socialism, and it wasn't until I got towards the end that I started to enjoy it, because all the time I had going through my mind socialism. Can you define socialism, please?
Yes, this is one of the great problems that we have in our understanding, just like the people were muddled at the end of Asses in Clover, because we are fed lines of information. And so we are told that capitalism is good, socialism is bad. If you remember Animal Farm, George Orwell, and so on, all of these ideas are fed down to us. And so in the kind of circle where I grew up, which was in a northern city where I was brought up by a socialist family, people were concerned about the municipality. They were concerned about their local authority, and they wanted to provide facilities for the poor and for everybody to join together for good education, good caring services, and people involved themselves voluntarily in local politics, and that was socialism. But there was also the socialism of communism. And the communists had taken over Russia and imposed a planned state economy. And that's what many people mean by socialism. And this is quite a different kettle of fish altogether, because it's only nominally socialism in the true sense that real socialists and Fabian socialists would mean the word, because it is exactly the same as that apex of power that we were talking about just now. And some of us know that there are the interlinks between them. So that is socialism, as we in the capitalist world have been told that to attack it, because it is a dictatorship, which indeed it is. But that doesn't mean that socialism. I don't know whether this is answering the question really, but that it is a problem that we have on occasions when we've sent out materials. Sometimes people have requested copies of the books or the social creditor, and then they've read the word socialism in it somewhere and have sent them back because they didn't want anything to do with socialism. And in this way, the people, that is us, are confused.
Dr. Hutchinson, I'm curious as to, in your thinking about this, when did you decide that you were not a socialist, in that sense?
I don't know that I ever said that I wasn't a socialist. No, I'm certainly not a socialist in the sense of in favour of state regulation and centralised bureaucracy. What happened in the book, if you read it carefully, is that in the UK, the Labour Party emerged from a group of Fabian, a collective of Fabian gathering, in which there were guild socialists and there were, they became the Fabian socialists. And those Fabian socialists took over the Labour Party, and when, after the First World War, they were taking over from the Liberals as the second party in power, they drew up a constitution, and that constitution was drawn up by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, particularly Sidney Webb. They were not in sympathy with the Guild socialists, and throughout the UK there have always been a movement of independent, the Independent Labour Party, which is the Guild Socialist wing of the Labour Party, who kept to the views that I described of local provision and caring for people, and certainly not wanting state control. But the Fabians, the Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb, they actually went to Russia. They were in favour. They were taken around and they were taken in by what was supposedly going on in Russia. And they were also, of course, taken in by the propaganda of the powers that be at the top of the apex, in that they were instrumental in setting up the London School of Economics, which was set up in order to teach the Labour politicians proper capitalist economics. So I have always been, and would always say I was a socialist. When I mentioned earlier about socialism and social credit, just that so many people look at the word social credit and then identify that with a state socialism. And again, it's muddled thinking, and we have to be clear. There's some excellent work by the socialists, that in that sense of the guild socialists, people like William Morris. His writings are fascinating, his political writings, which are ignored by the capitalist hierarchy because they are dangerous to the mainstream way of thinking. And the same for John Ruskin. I have got a copy here with me, but not today, of a little booklet which is How to Be Rich. And that takes up the ideas of John Ruskin, which he wrote in Unto This Last. It's done in a comic form, and it was circulated to schools a couple of years ago in the north of the UK. And it's a very entertaining introduction to what is wrong with the present value system in the world today. And I'll perhaps bring it along tomorrow. And I'll convert you all to socialism.
Dr. Hutchinson, the Labour Party in the UK, have they looked at the social credit at all, and have they made, back in history, and made a decision why they would not go that way? I know that here in Australia they did. I had a book that I lent it to somebody and never got it back again, but in that book it points out that they studied social credit and they just didn't agree with the financial side of it. What was it like in the UK?
I prefer to approach it from a different direction. When social credit was discussed and became a powerful movement in the UK, it was very powerful indeed. I mean, there were social credit groups in every city, more than one, several, and the subject, really, it's amazing how much it was ignored in the mainstream press. But when you look at the social credit press, you see how much was actually going on and how much support there was for the study of social credit and discussion of these ideas. Now, we know about the political party system. This is what happened in Alberta, was that they dismissed the political party system. And that's why they were powerful, and that's why they were dangerous, and that's why they had to be silenced. So politicians, I mean, some politicians will go in out of the goodness of their hearts, but like everything else, you have a career to follow. You build up your expertise. You have to work within the institutions that are there, unless you all, stand as independents, which is in fact what the social credit people were doing. So your politicians are going to inevitably be having at least one eye on the hierarchy of the party. And so they're going to be very careful about what ideas they take on board, which might clash with the policies of the party. So it's interesting to see, when you look at the history, that quite a number of the Labour politicians, it was the Labour politicians, did support social credit ideas and did write and speak on the subject. So it was a powerful movement, and what they tried to do in the 1930s, late 1930s, in the UK, was to put up candidates who would be, or to ask candidates in the different political parties if they would support social credit. Sometimes we can be critical of other people without understanding where they're coming from, and then we get into clashes rather than building on interest. So we have to understand a little bit and work around that. I don't know if that answers your question, but basically, yes, there were people in the UK who were very firm supporters of social credit. After all, it also came out of the trade union movement, because it was the trade unionists who, first of all, asked the Labour Party to consider social credit as its policy in the early 1920s. And that was the time when Sidney and Beatrice Webb were establishing the mainstream political party that would be approved of by the financial powers. And so it was rejected at that point by the main party, but it was the trade unionists who had asked for that to be considered, and it was through the trade union branches that Douglas's ideas initially spread. Again, we forget that we do need existing organisations in order to spread ideas, and unless we can latch on to and work within organisations. And this is why I think it would be important to get the academic world to look again at social credit. And it is no good trying to stand out there with our correct views without engaging with existing groupings and so on.